You are a driller working under the brutal Australian sun. The outback around you stretches endlessly, a horizon of scorched red earth and brittle spinifex grass. Heat shimmers off the ground like liquid glass. You're focused on the rhythmic growl of machinery, the kind of industrial sound that becomes background noise after long hours. Then your drill strikes something, not rock, not earth. Something hollow, metal. The vibrations feel wrong, the sound echoing back through the soil with a dull resonance. You shut the machine off. For a moment, there is silence. The silence of the desert, absolute, suffocating, broken only by the shrill cry of a crow overhead. When the dust settles, the shape begins to emerge. Rusted steel, corroded edges. At first glance, it looks like a scrap vehicle swallowed by sand years ago. But as you brush away layers of earth with your hands, a more horrifying truth becomes clear. It's a truck. Buried almost to the roofline. And sealed inside. There are bodies. This was not just some long abandoned vehicle left to rot in the outback. This was a tomb. The men around you stumble back, their boots crunching in dry earth. The air is hotter, heavier now. You swear you can smell it, an ancient odor escaping cracks in the corroded metal. The smell of death that had been locked away for over a decade. What you've uncovered today isn't a relic of machinery. It is the doorway to a mystery stretching back 11 years, to the vanishing of two young travelers whose disappearance left families broken, towns unsettled, and authorities baffled. 2 lives swallowed whole by the desert, and now, finally unearthed. In 2009, Daniel Morgan was 23 years old. Tall, wiry, with a mop of sun-bleached hair and a restless spirit. He'd grown up in Brisbane, the youngest of 3 brothers, always chasing the horizon. He carried a battered notebook where he sketched crude maps and scrawled half-poems about places he'd never seen. With him was his closest friend, Aaron Walsh, 24. Dark-haired, quieter, with a thoughtful gaze behind his wireframe glasses. Where Daniel was reckless, Aaron was grounded. Where Daniel chased chaos, Aaron observed it. The two balanced each other, bound together by years of friendship forged in high school classrooms and late-night drives. They weren't just backpackers drifting through Australia, they were seekers. Daniel wanted adventure, Aaron wanted stories. And together, they found themselves heading west, drawn into the beating heart of the outback. An unforgiving stretch of wilderness where roads vanish into dust and the line between life and death thins with each mile. Their plan was simple, at least on paper. Drive an old second-hand truck they had picked up in Alice Springs, take the long route through the desert toward Kalgoorlie, and work odd jobs along the way. For them, it wasn't about where they ended up. It was about the journey they were. Last seen alive at a small roadhouse in Coober Pedy. The date, August 14th, 2009. They ordered fuel, 2 bottles of water, and a packet of salted peanuts. The cashier remembered Aaron apologizing for Daniel's laughter as he spilled change on the counter. It was ordinary, unremarkable. And then, they vanished into the horizon. The Australian outback is not just empty land. It is a labyrinth of silence, heat, and mirages that can drive even seasoned travelers to panic. Roads stretch on for hundreds of kilometers with no fuel, no water, no shade. Temperatures climb beyond 40 degrees Celsius, and once the sun drops, the heat bleeds away, replaced by bitter cold. In such a place, even a simple breakdown can become a death sentence. For Daniel and Aaron, the desert would become both backdrop and executioner. When their families failed to hear from them for several days, alarms were raised. Both young men were diligent about staying in touch. Daniel sent postcards. Aaron made regular phone calls to his mother. Silence was not in their nature. By the time the alarm reached police, nearly 2 weeks had passed since the last confirmed sighting at that roadhouse. And when the search began, the desert showed nothing. Authorities launched one of the largest Missing person searches in the region that year. Helicopters scanned the desert in widening circles, their shadows crawling across cracked salt flats. K-9 units were deployed near highways, noses pressed to asphalt and dust. Volunteers trekked into scrubland with compasses, radios, and dwindling hope. Searchers noted the brutality of the conditions. Days were spent in blistering heat, nights in freezing cold. Helicopter pilots reported mirages that bent the horizon. Tricks of the light that made even seasoned eyes doubt what they saw. Tracks in the sand led nowhere, erased by wind. For weeks, the desert was combed. Every abandoned shack, every dry creek bed, every roadside turnout. And still, no sign of the two men. The only possible clue came from a pilot who, during an aerial sweep, claimed to spot a faint dust trail that abruptly ended in the middle of nowhere. No tire tracks leading in. No tire tracks leading out. Just a patch of disturbed earth, fading into silence. Search teams on the ground never located it again. And slowly, painfully, the search unraveled. By late September, the official search wound down. The families clung to hope, but investigators admitted the desert rarely gave back what it took. Posters were taped to gas stations, flapping in hot wind until they curled and faded. Media coverage dwindled. In Brisbane, Daniel's mother left the porch light on every night. Aaron's father continued to call his son's phone, long after it was disconnected, just to hear the automated voice that said, "This number is no longer in service." Months passed. Then years. By the time the 5th anniversary of their disappearance arrived, the two travelers were little more than names etched into missing person databases. The desert had one. Or so it seemed. Now in the crushing heat of 2020, a driller's machine has struck something buried. A rusted shape beneath layers of sand. A truck. As the workers scrape away more earth, they realize this isn't just an abandoned vehicle lost to time. The windows are sealed, metal edges warped with deliberate force. The interior is locked tight. A capsule entombed in dust. One worker presses his face to the corroded glass. Inside, something pale, fragile and horrifying stares back. Skeletal face. The missing travelers have been found, sealed in metal, trapped for 11 years. And the worst question of all, who put them there? The rediscovery of the rusted truck reopened the cold case files from 2009. Investigators laid out the timeline again, piece by piece, trying to reconstruct the travelers' final days before the desert erased them. August 12, 2009, Daniel and Aaron were seen leaving Alice Springs in their recently purchased second-hand truck, a faded blue 1987 Toyota Helix with peeling paint and mismatched tires. They carried a few basic supplies: jerry cans of water, canned beans, a camping stove, and a roll of tarpaulin. Daniel's notebook was tucked into the glove box. August 14, 2009, 5:47 p.m. They stopped at a roadhouse in Coober Pedy. A fuel receipt timestamped the moment. Aaron called his mother from a payphone, assuring her that the next leg of their journey would be long and quiet. That was the last voice contact anyone ever had with them. August 15, 2009, a truck driver recalled seeing a faded blue Helix parked on the side of the Stewart Highway just after dawn. He couldn't remember the exact kilometer marker, only that the hood was up and two figures were bent over the engine. He drove on. From that point, the trail vanishes. No bank activity, no phone signals, no GPS traces, nothing. The initial search in 2009 had been exhaustive. Ground teams combed more than 1,500 square kilometers of desert scrub and salt pan. Aerial sweeps covered 400 flight hours, with pilots reporting only endless dunes and the occasional shadow of a camel train. K-9 units traced the Helix's scent to a small dirt turnout, but the trail evaporated after only a few meters. Abandoned shafts and mines around Coober Pedy were checked, their air thick with the smell of dust and fuel. Even water holes, Long dry, were prodded and scanned, but there was never a trace of the helix, as though the vehicle, and the men inside it, had simply dissolved into the landscape. For Daniel's family, the waiting was unbearable. His older brother, Michael, later recalled in interviews, "You look at the map of Australia, and you realize how big it is. And you think, if they're out there, how could anyone find them? How could we even know where to begin?" It felt like the earth had swallowed them whole. Aaron's parents were quieter, their grief more internal. His father still walked the same path each morning before dawn, along the river near his home, whispering his son's name as though Aaron might step out of the mist and answer. Both families organized vigils. They left candles burning outside, courthouses, and pinned photographs to bulletin boards. Over the years, the faces of the two men faded beneath layers of new posters, lost pets, community events, political slogans. The desert was patient. The families were not. There were moments of cruel hope. In 2011, police received a tip from a drifter who claimed he had seen two young men fitting Daniel and Aaron's description hitchhiking near Port Augusta. The lead collapsed when the supposed sightings turned out to be of two German BSCKPACKERS. In 2013, human remains were found in the Simpson Desert. Families held their breath until forensic testing proved they belonged to an older miner who had vanished. In the 1980s. By 2015, the case was officially cold. The files gathered dust, evidence boxes sealed with yellow tape, photographs curling at the edges, but in every interview, in every documentary segment produced over the years, investigators repeated the same haunting refrain: "If we could just find the vehicle, we could find the truth." And now in 2020, that wish has been granted. The helix lay buried in the earth, sealed deliberately. The roof was barely visible before the driller's machinery exposed it. Investigators believe it had been covered intentionally, sand piled, and compacted until the desert reclaimed it. The state of the vehicle was chilling. Windows blackened with rust, the doors corroded shut. Tires collapsed inward, skeletal remnants of rubber. But what was inside was worse. Peering through the glass revealed two figures. Skeletal remains positioned unnaturally. One in the passenger seat, upright, hands still resting in their lap. The other slumped toward the driver's side, bones at odd angles, the remnants of clothing clinging like paper to their frames. The desert had preserved them, in silence, when the remains were carefully extracted and flown to Adelaide for examination. Forensic pathologists spoke cautiously. 11 years is a long time for the desert to work on a body. Yet certain truths could still be uncovered. Fibers of fabric, stains in the metal, the angle of bones. But before autopsy results were released, speculation roared back to life. Some said they had died of heat stroke after becoming trapped in the vehicle. Others whispered of foul play, that someone had sealed them inside. The discovery of the truck, though, introduced an even darker possibility, that they had not simply vanished into the desert, but had been deliberately hidden beneath it. In Coober Pedy, locals who remembered the case shook their heads in disbelief. The roadhouse cashier, now older, admitted she still recalled Aaron's polite voice, Daniel's laughter. Truck drivers passing through muttered at bars that it didn't add up. No one just buries a truck like that. The desert may erase evidence, but it does not erase memory. And in the minds of those who had once searched for the two travelers, the rediscovery wasn't closure. It was reopening a wound that had never healed. As investigators returned to the site where the truck was unearthed, they began to find small but telling details. Scratches along the chassis, patterns in the sand that suggested the vehicle had not broken down but been forced off-road, and something else, faint evidence of human activity nearby. As if the desert hadn't just swallowed Daniel and Aaron by accident, but that someone had helped it consume them. Inside Adelaide's forensic lab, the two travelers' remains were laid out under the white blaze of sterile lights. What the desert had taken, the bones would return. The pathologist worked slowly. Every fragment of fabric, every thread of tissue was catalogued. A faded plaid shirt still clung to one of the skeletons, its cotton fibers sun-bleached and thin as parchment. A hiking boot was intact, though its laces had snapped and its sole curled like burnt paper. The cause of death was not immediately obvious. No bullet wounds in the bones, no signs of animal predation. But there were irregularities. The skeleton and the passenger seat bore fractures in the ribs, the kind not typically caused by desert collapse but by blunt force trauma. The driver's remains showed wrist bones with unusual stress patterns, as though ligatures had once been tied tightly around them, and most damning, traces of adhesive residue along the inside of the vehicle's doors, as if they had been sealed from the outside. This was no accident. This was confinement. When these findings leaked into the press, speculation erupted. Voluntary isolation. Some argued the travelers had sealed themselves in the truck, possibly in a desperate attempt to escape the blistering heat or dust storms. Yet this theory unraveled quickly. No one would tape themselves inside a metal oven in 40 degrees Celsius desert sun. Local conflict. Others believed the pair had crossed paths with locals, opal miners, drifters, or smugglers, and paid for it. Coober Pedy has long been infamous for its labyrinth of underground dugouts and harsh characters. A dispute over money, or even a simple act of perceived disrespect, could have spiraled into violence, predatory obsession. A darker theory emerged, that someone had deliberately staged their entombment, turning the truck into a sarcophagus. A slow, cruel method of death hidden beneath the desert. Investigators leaned toward foul play, not just because of the evidence, but because someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury the truth beneath meters of sand. A second expedition team was dispatched to the site. Unlike the drillers who had stumbled across the vehicle, these were trained forensic archaeologists. They mapped the soil layers surrounding the truck, studying compression, density, and disturbances. Their findings were chilling. The earth around the truck had been manually shifted. Layers of sand and gravel compacted in a pattern consistent with heavy machinery. Small fragments of rope fibers were recovered near the rear wheel well, almost fossilized into the soil. A rusted bent shovel blade was discovered 30 meters away, half buried. This wasn't abandonment. It was deliberate burial. When Daniel's brother, Michael, was informed of the autopsy details, he sat silently for several minutes before saying only, "They weren't lost. Someone did this to them. Someone put them in the ground." Aaron's parents, who had long hoped for an accident, heat stroke, dehydration, something natural, were left shattered by the implication of murder. In interviews, Aaron's father whispered through tears, "I begged God for answers. I never thought the answer would be this." The investigation was reclassified from unexplained disappearance to homicide inquiry. Detectives began pulling old statements, re-interviewing locals, and combing through forgotten leads. One name surfaced again and again: a reclusive opal miner named Clive Rourke. In 2009, Rourke had been questioned briefly. He lived alone in a dugout on the outskirts of Coober Pedy. Witnesses claim he often boasted about outsiders who didn't belong in the desert. Police at the time dismissed him due to lack of evidence. But now, revisiting his file, detectives found something they had overlooked. Rourke owned a front-end loader, a piece of heavy equipment capable of burying a truck. He had a violent history, assault charges in 1997, a conviction for unlawful detention in 2002. In August 2009, neighbors noted he disappeared from town for several weeks. The same weeks Daniel and Aaron vanished. Detectives returned to the area around the burial site, this time extending their search radius. 40 minutes north, inside a dried creek bed, they discovered something else. Fragments of duct tape, sun-brittled, but intact. A rusted canteen with Aaron's initials scratched into the base. And half buried in the sand, a pair of cracked eyeglasses. later identified as Daniel's. Each artifact pointed toward captivity, items discarded, lost or dropped in struggle before the final burial. The desert, though patient, does not keep all secrets forever. Investigators built a psychological profile of Rourke. Not a madman in the cinematic sense, but something more chilling. A man consumed by territorial obsession. He believed the Outback belonged to him, that outsiders were trespassers, unworthy of crossing his land. Neighbors recalled his cryptic mutterings. The desert decides who stays. The ground swallows what don't belong. For years, these were dismissed as eccentric ramblings. Now they read like confession. But even with mounting evidence, one question haunted detectives. Why seal the men inside the truck? Why not leave them to the desert like so many others who perished out there? The answer would emerge, but not yet. First, detectives needed something undeniable, the kind of evidence that could stand in court, not just in whispers around town. And in the depths of Rourke's abandoned dugout, they would find it. Police descended into the abandoned dugout where Clive Rourke had once lived. The walls were rough-hewn, carved into the sandstone, lined with rusted mining tools, and forgotten. Relics of desert survival. At first, the space looked ordinary. A bed frame of corroded metal, a table, empty bottles. Then, deeper in the shadows, they found a locked steel cabinet. Inside were artifacts no one expected, but which told the story with horrifying clarity. A roll of industrial duct tape, the same brand and lot number as the fragments near the burial site. A faded journal, its pages stained with sweat and dust. And most damning, a Polaroid photograph, curled and brittle, showing two men sitting in the cab of a truck. Daniel and Aaron, their expressions strained, eyes wide, hands bound in their laps. The photo was dated August 14, 2009. The journal was not a confession, but something worse, a manifesto. Rourke wrote obsessively about the desert as a living judge. He claimed outsiders poisoned the land, and that only those who endured silence, heat, and hunger deserved to remain. One entry read, "They cry for water. They pound the doors. But the desert doesn't listen, and neither do I. This is justice." By the time investigators pieced the evidence together, Clive Rourke was already gone. In 2017, years after the travelers disappeared, he had suffered a heart attack in a roadside diner and been buried in an unmarked grave outside Coober Pedy. The villain had escaped earthly justice. But his journal, his photographs, and the bones in the desert spoke for him louder than any trial ever could. Detectives built the final timeline. Daniel and Aaron met Rourke near a roadside diner, asking for directions north. Rourke lured them, claiming he knew a shortcut, somewhere in the desert, under threat. He bound their wrists and forced them into the cab of the truck. He sealed the doors with tape, locking them inside a steel coffin. Using his front-end loader, he buried the vehicle under tons of sand. The deaths were not quick. Forensic tests suggested carbon dioxide buildup and heat stroke would have taken hours. Their final moments were spent trapped, together, in silence, as the desert swallowed them whole. When presented with the evidence, the families broke in different ways. Michael, Daniel's brother, spoke bitterly. He lived free until his heart gave out. "My brother suffocated in a grave of sand. Where's the justice in that?" Aaron's father held the cracked hiking boot in his hands and wept quietly. He said, "At least they were together. At least we know." The knowledge brought no comfort, only weight. The story spread across Australia, retold in hushed voices at roadside stops and mining camps. Parents warned travelers not to trust the kindness of strangers on desolate highways. The rusted truck was eventually hauled from the desert, preserved in a police impound lot. But in Coober Pedy, some whispered that it should have been left where it was, a tomb marker, a warning. Imagine standing in the endless flat of the Outback at dusk. The horizon burns red, shadows stretch long, and the only sound is your own heartbeat. It is in this silence that Daniel and Aaron died, sealed in steel, buried by human hands, betrayed not by the desert itself, but by the cruelty of a man who believed the land was his alone. And long after his own death, the silence remains. The desert swallows, the desert keeps, the desert waits, because sometimes the harshest landscapes aren't found in nature. They're carved in the hearts of men.